The narrative we're diving into today is, well, it's one of the most famous and I think one of the most fiercely debated stories of modern wilderness seeking.
It's absolutely fascinating and tragic, of course.
Right. It's the story of this brilliant young man, Christopher Johnson McCandless, who came from a really comfortable, privileged background.
And he just walks away from it all.
Completely. He gives away his entire fortune, sheds his identity, and sets out to find some kind of meaning, some sort of absolute self-reliance in the Alaskan bush.
He even gives himself a new name.
Alexander Supertramp. And that's who we're tracking today, his radical 2-year journey.
It's such a powerful story because it really presents this irreconcilable conflict, you know? It's the collision between these incredibly noble, almost transcendental ideals.
And the complete, almost catastrophic lack of practical sense.
Exactly. His entire odyssey culminates in the vast, remote Alaska interior, specifically right up near the boundary of Denali National Park.
And the scene of the end, the physical evidence of his final days, that's really what cemented this story in the public mind.
Oh, absolutely. It was September 1992. 3 different groups of people, one of them a party of moose hunters, all converge on this one spot.
And they find this abandoned Fairbanks City Transit bus. Bus 142. It's just sitting there, this rusted-out, kind of incongruous monument about 25 miles west of Healy.
Right on the Stampede Trail. And the scene inside that bus was just undeniably grim. It immediately sparked this intense public scrutiny.
And what they found was McCandless's body, badly decomposed,
wrapped in a blue sleeping bag that his mother, Billy, had meticulously sewn for him, which is just a heartbreaking detail.
It really is.
And when the autopsy was later performed in Anchorage, the physical decay, it really spoke volumes about his suffering. The coroner noted his remains weighed a mere 67 pounds.
67 pounds?
Yeah, with virtually no subcutaneous fat left at all. On the surface, it looked like a clear-cut case of starvation.
And instantly, the cultural battle lines were drawn. The author John Krakauer, who wrote the definitive book on his life, he noted that readers almost immediately split into these 2 opposing camps.
They really did.
On one side, you had people who just admired Alexander Supertramp immensely. They saw him as this romantic hero.
Right. They saw the courage, the willingness to challenge what they saw as the suffocating norms of a consumer society. They saw the nobility in his uncompromising search for truth.
But then you have the other side, the equally fervent detractors.
And they saw him as a naive, reckless idiot, a self-absorbed narcissist who died not because of some grand philosophical quest, but out of sheer avoidable stupidity.
They see the whole journey as a display of staggering arrogance, a pointless death that came from a profound failure of basic common sense.
It's such a stark divide.
It is. And so our mission today is to unpack the evidence for both sides. We're going to chronologically track how the accomplished Chris McCandless systematically shed his identity to become Alexander Supertramp.
We'll get into the intense, almost monastic philosophy that drove him.
And most critically, we are going to delve into the precise and ultimately heartbreakingly avoidable circumstances that led to his death on that trail.
Okay, let's do it.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the world he was so desperate to escape.
To understand the intensity of McCandless's rejection, you absolutely have to appreciate the privilege and the success he walked away from.
It wasn't just a comfortable life. It was a life of high achievement.
It really was. He was raised in Annandale, Virginia, right in the heart of the American upper middle class. And his father, Walt McCandless, was this highly accomplished aerospace engineer.
He designed radar systems for the space shuttle program, right?
That's him. And on top of that, he was the owner of a very successful consulting firm. So this was a household really defined by professional rigor, intellectual achievement, and, well, material comfort.
And Chris himself was a product of that. A real high achiever.
Oh, completely. Nearly perfect grades, Dean's List at Emory University. But even in his youth, you start to see this uncompromising, almost rigid ethical streak that would define his later actions.
You're talking about the high school physics story.
That's the one. It's such a perfect little window into his psychology. He gets an F in physics. Not because he couldn't do the work, he was brilliant, but because he refused to follow the mandated report format.
He just thought the rules are arbitrary and stupid.
Exactly. He decided his internal moral compass, his own sense of what was correct, was superior to the teacher's authority. And he was willing to take the F to prove his point.
That really illustrates the core of his personality, doesn't it? This blend of high intelligence and this this unwavering, almost monomaniacal belief in his own ethical rectitude.
It's a paradox, too, because he was also immensely generous. I mean, he was known to buy food for the homeless. There's a story about him secretly housing a vagrant in his parents' Airstream trailer for days.
Right, so he had this deep empathy.
He did, but that generosity was twinned with what Krakauer called an unwavering self-absorption, a tendency to internalize every disappointment and to resist any external control over his life choices.
So if he had this black and white view of ethics, where did that deep, simmering anger and distrust come from? Because the source material is pretty clear. It didn't come from poverty or oppression. It came from inside his own home.
Precisely. The anger, the real emotional catalyst for this dramatic break with his family and his life, it started to boil over when he discovered the extent of his father's double life.
This is during a cross-country trip after high school in '88.
Right. He was visiting some old family friends, and he starts to piece together that his father, Walt, had maintained a secret, ongoing relationship with his first wife, Marcia.
Even after Chris was born to his second wife, Billy.
Yes. For years, Walt was essentially dividing his time between two households. He even fathered another son, Quinn, with Marcia 2 full years after Chris's birth.
Wow. So Walt was operating in this deep ethical gray zone for years. For a young man like Chris, who saw the world in such stark moral terms, that deception must have felt like a massive psychological earthquake.
It did. The book says Chris felt this profound betrayal made his entire childhood seem like a fiction. He saw the foundational structure of his life as completely fraudulent.
But he didn't confront them about it, did he? Not in a big dramatic way.
No, and that's key. Rather than a screaming confrontational breakup, he chose silent withdrawal. He didn't yell at his parents about the deception. He internalized the rage. He let the bad feelings just build and build until they sort of necessitated this radical physical separation from the source of that pain.
So that silent rage became the engine for his final odyssey.
It absolutely did.
Which brings us to 1990. He's just graduated from Emory. He's talked about going to Harvard Law. There's a path laid out for him. But instead, he starts systematically stripping away every single tether to that life.
The first thing to go is the money.
His entire college fund savings, $25,000. He donates it, all of it, to Oxfam.
And you have to wonder, was that just to shock his parents? Or was it a genuine philosophical commitment to anti-materialism?
What do you think?
I think it was genuine. I mean, it was absolutely rooted in his reading of people like Thoreau and Tolstoy. That money represented the system, the life, that he felt was tainted by his father's deception.
So by donating it, he wasn't just rejecting wealth.
He was purifying himself. He was shedding the very infrastructure that supported the deception he hated. He wanted his life to be honest, rigorous, and completely untainted by that kind of compromise.
Which leads directly to the physical rejection of the last remnants of his old life.
The Datsun.
His secondhand yellow Datsun. He drives it west, gets to the Lake Mead National Recreation Area in July 1990, and he steers the car off-road into a place called Digital Wash, where fate, or maybe just bad judgment, intervenes.
A flash flood soaks the engine, drains the battery trying to restart it. And this is where his decision-making just diverges completely from what most of us would do.
Right. A broken-down car in the middle of a wash is a massive headache, a huge problem.
But for Chris, it was an epiphany. He actually wrote in his journal that he felt exhilarated. The material world had failed him, and in doing so, it had set him free.
So he embraces it. He just abandons the car right there. He strips off the license plates, hides his deer hunting rifle.
And then comes the big symbolic act, this almost liturgical act of financial renunciation.
He collects all his remaining paper currency, a pathetic little stack of bills totaling $123, and he sets it on fire.
Just watch as it turn to ash. That was the true birth of Alexander Supertramp and the establishment of his core nomadic doctrine. Own nothing except what you can carry on your back at a dead run.
He was trying to eliminate the possibility of compromise, right?
Exactly. Rejecting the cash meant no turning back, no safety net. It was an absolute all-in commitment to the ideals he believed in, where survival relied entirely on your wits, not your capital.
And as a bizarre little footnote to that story, that Datsun he abandoned. The Park Service found it later.
And it was in surprisingly good shape.
It was. They actually fixed it up and used it as an undercover vehicle for drug interdiction for 3 years. The irony is just cinematic. The symbol of his anti-establishment purity becomes an instrument of law enforcement.
You can't make it up.
So after burning his money and abandoning the car, McCandless spends the next 2 years just wandering the West. He's embracing the life of a little tramp.
But what's genuinely fascinating about this period is the constant, intense human connection he established.
Despite his stated desire for radical isolation.
Exactly. He fled his family, but he kept finding these accidental communities everywhere he went. His journey was really a string of these profound, if brief, accidental relationships. He had this powerful charisma that just drew people in, even as he was trying to push the world away.
And one of the first and most critical people he met was Wayne Westerberg.
Right, in Carthage, South Dakota.
Westerberg hired McCandless to work at his grain elevator. What did he say about Chris's work ethic versus his overall common sense? Because this seems to be the crux of the later tragedy.
Westerberg held him in immensely high regard as a worker. He called him the hardest worker he had ever seen. Incredibly ethical, fiercely intelligent. He respected authority on the job site, was neat, rigorous in his duties.
Right.
But Westerberg also identified these huge gaps in his thinking. The microwave oven story is the perfect illustration. Chris used it to cook a chicken, and he let the grease drain to the bottom. But he never, ever thought to clean the grease trap, even though he was otherwise meticulous about everything.
So that suggests an inability to connect, like a theoretical idea of cleanliness or effort with the mundane, practical maintenance required.
Exactly that. Westerberg concluded that McCandless did too much thinking. He was trying too hard to make sense of the world, but he lacked basic common sense in simple, practical application. He could read the philosophical roadmap of Tolstoy, but not the instructional manual for his immediate environment. He was substituting idealism for practical knowledge.
He resisted settling down, though he did stop moving for over 2 months in Bullhead City, Arizona. That was the longest stretch he spent in one place before Alaska.
He did. He actually got a job at an Italian restaurant there and was squatting in a vacant mobile home that was managed by an old man named Charlie, whom he described in a letter as a lunatic.
He even entertained the idea of normalcy there for a minute.
He did. In a letter to a friend, Jan Burrs, he suggested he might finally settle down and abandon my tramping life. But ultimately, the call of the road, that philosophical need for the unconquered, it always pulled him back.
And he visited Jan Burrs and her boyfriend Bob at the Slabs in Nyland, California. The Slabs, for our listeners, are this sort of seasonal gathering place for an itinerant society of snowbirds and drifters.
And he impressed them greatly. He even played the electric organ at their campsite, and he talked in detail with so much enthusiasm about his plans for Alaska.
The irony there is so rich. He's sharing his detailed plans for solitude with what is essentially a surrogate family.
His whole philosophy during this period was just fueled by literature, particularly the works of Jack London.
The call of the wild to build a fire.
Exactly. He was mesmerized by London's condemnation of capitalism and his glorification of the primordial, untamed world.
But the source material, through Krakauer's eye, points out this crucial irony about his hero, London, an irony that McCandless appeared to completely overlook.
He really did. He seemed to ignore the fact that Jack London died young, at 40, on his fancy California estate. He only ever spent a single brutal winter in the North.
Krakauer's words were, what, a fatuous drunk, obese, and pathetic?
Something like that. His luxurious life bore almost no resemblance to the rugged ideals he wrote about. McCandless was mistaking the fiction, the romanticized ideal, for reality.
He believed the life in London stories, this pure struggle against nature, was the path to truth.
And he ignored the fact that the author of those stories had chosen comfort over that struggle as soon as he could afford it.
And that really sets the stage for maybe his most profound accidental relationship, the one that highlights the emotional wake he left behind. Ronald Franz.
Ah, Ron Franz, yes. He was an 80-year-old widower living in Salton City. They met in January 1992.
And Franz was lonely. He was recovering from the death of his wife and his son, and he quickly took this deep, almost paternal interest in Chris.
He did. They spent a lot of time together. Chris learned leatherworking from him, and Franz just grew incredibly fond of this young man.
So Chris, the great philosopher of the void, repays this kindness by lecturing Franz on the philosophical shortcomings of a sedentary existence.
He writes Franz this letter that basically becomes the manifesto for his lifestyle. It's a powerful piece of writing.
It is. He urged Franz to abandon his predictable life, writing, "Don't settle down and sit in one place. Move around, be nomadic, make each day a new horizon."
He goes on, "You are still going to live a long time, Ron, and it would be a shame if you did not take the opportunity to revolutionize your life and move into an entirely new realm of experience."
And the impact on Franz was, well, it was staggering.
He took the advice literally, put his possessions in storage, bought a van, and drove to McCandless's old campsite and just waited there for Alex to return.
And then, in December of '92, he learns of Chris's death from some passing hitchhikers.
And the emotional fallout was just catastrophic. Franz, who was a devout man, felt such a powerful sense of loss and betrayal by fate. He renounced his faith, withdrew his church membership.
Became an atheist.
Became an atheist, raging against the God who had promised to watch over his surrogate son. He bought a bottle of whiskey, hoping it would kill him, but it only made him sick.
That depth of emotion caused by a young man who was actively fleeing human intimacy and responsibility, it just speaks volumes about McCandless's charisma and the complex, profound grief he left in his wake.
He wanted absolute self-reliance, but he kept inspiring devotion wherever he went. It's another of the central paradoxes of his life.
Okay, so by March 1992, McCandless is back in Carthage, South Dakota. He's working for Westerberg again, earning a final grub stake for the big one, the Alaska expedition.
And he is laser-focused. He's rigid in his planning, even if that planning lacks some basic practicalities.
His refusal to compromise his ideals, even slightly, really defined his preparation.
Absolutely. When Westerberg offered to buy him a plane ticket to Fairbanks to save him valuable time, McCandless refused point blank.
What was his reasoning?
He said, "No, I want to hitch north. Flying would be cheating. It would wreck the whole trip." This belief that the purity of the journey was more important than practical efficiency is just so critical to understanding him.
That mindset carried him to the final leg. April 28, 1992, outside Fairbanks, he gets picked up by Jim Gallion,
An Alaskan electrician, and the last person to see Chris McCandless alive.
And Gallion, right away, recognizes the recklessness of this kid's plan.
Right.
And his equipment. What exactly did Chris have with him?
Not much. His backpack weighed maybe 10 or 11 pounds. It had a 10-pound bag of rice, a borrowed flimsy sleeping bag,
And that small rifle.
a small .22 caliber rifle, and he was wearing cheap hiking boots. Gallion, who's an experienced Alaskan, he tried repeatedly to dissuade him. He called the whole scheme foolhardy.
He warned him about the rifle, right?
Right.
That it was totally inadequate for a larger game or, God forbid, a grizzly.
He did. He also pointed out that the trees in that region, the spruce, were too small and skinny to climb if you ran into danger.
And McCandless just had an answer for every warning. He was determined, gung-ho. He refused to take the advice of someone who actually lived and worked in that environment.
Yes. He refused Gallion's money, refused his offer of decent gear, though Gallion did eventually convince him to at least take a pair of 2 large rubber work boots and a couple of sandwiches.
And he tried to give Gallion his watch.
He did, asserting, "I don't want to know what time it is. I don't want to know what day it is or where I am." That intense rejection of the basic structure of civilization was absolute, but it blinded him to the necessity of preparation.
So he walks down the Stampede Trail. A day or two later, he reaches Bus 142, this old 1940s International Harvester that was abandoned by a construction company back in 1963. It would become his shelter for the next 112 days.
And his journal entries, they show this immediate shift from philosophical idealism to brutal reality. Just one-word entries: weakness, snowed in, disaster. He was subsisting mostly on that bag of rice, small game, and whatever he could forage.
The first major practical test came in early June. He manages to shoot a moose.
Which should have been a turning point, a massive infusion of sustenance. And even though he was ambivalent about killing animals, he recognized the gift and he dedicated himself to preserving this immense quantity of meat.
But he goes about it all wrong. He spends 6 days trying to preserve the meat based on advice he'd heard from some hunters back in South Dakota. He tries to smoke it.
Right, he excavates a little burrow in a stream bank and tries to smoke it, but this was just a catastrophic failure in the Alaskan context.
Why? What's the correct way to do it there?
The standard Alaskan practice for preserving meat in the bush, especially in the heat of early summer, is not smoking. Smoking requires constant expert tending and very specific conditions. It's incredibly difficult.
So what do?
The far more common and effective method is air drying. You slice the meat into thin, narrow strips and you hang it on a rack in the sun and wind to quickly desiccate it into jerky.
His attempt at smoking was just completely unsuited to the environment.
Utterly. And it ensured the meat spoiled almost immediately. A massive, tragic waste. He wrote in his journal, "Maggots already. Smoking appears ineffective. Don't know. Looks like disaster."
And then, I now wish I had never shot the moose. One of the greatest tragedies of my life.
He subsequently abandoned the rotting carcass to the wolves and scavengers, and that moment is just a perfect microcosm of his fatal flaw. He had the courage, he had the physical effort, but he applied the wrong knowledge for that specific locale.
He valued his book-learned ideals over the common, shared practical knowledge of the actual wilderness community he was trying to join.
And that leads us to the truly fatal mistake, the trap that irreversibly sealed his fate. The Teclanica River.
On July 3rd, after about 2 months, McCandless decides he's had enough. Maybe he's gained enough experience, maybe he's achieved enough solitude, and he decides to hike out.
And on July 5th, he reaches the river. And it is unrecognizable from the gentle stream he had waded across back in April.
The climate had changed everything.
It had. The river was at full flood. Its discharge multiplied 9 or 10 times in volume by the massive snowmelt and heavy rains draining from the glaciers high up in the Alaska Range.
It wasn't a thigh-deep crossing anymore.
Not even close.
Yeah.
It was a wide, violent torrent, opaque with glacial till, running so fast it literally rumbled like a freight train. McCandless, who was a weak swimmer and feared water, he correctly concluded it would be suicidal to even try to cross.
She retreats, and he writes in his journal, "River look impossible, lonely, scared." This is the moment where his idealism is completely stripped away by sheer terror and practical defeat.
It is.
And this is where the staggering, heartbreaking irony comes into play. His lack of one crucial practical item meant he completely missed his salvation.
The map.
He didn't have a topographic map.
No. He had discarded maps and compasses as unnecessary baggage. They were symbols of a pre-charted world that he rejected. If he'd had one, he would have known that just half a mile downstream, located right in the throat of the canyon, was a U.S. Geological Survey gauging station.
And what was so significant about that gauging station?
It was spanned by an inch-thick steel cable. And on that cable was an aluminum basket designed precisely for hydrologists to safely traverse the river, even when it was in full flood like that.
There's another cruel twist, isn't there?
There is. When McCandless tried to hike out, some local hunters had actually cut the chain securing the basket, and they left it on the far shore, on McCandless's side.
They did that specifically to make it harder for outsiders like Alex to cross back to the highway.
So the means of his salvation, the steel cable, the basket, was physically right there, on his side of the river, a half-mile walk away. But it remained incognito to him.
He was trapped not by nature, but by his philosophical choice to reject the map, the very tool that charted the civilization he claimed to despise.
Krakauer made a great point about this. McCandless yearned to wander uncharted country, but in 1992, there were no more blank spots on the map. Not really. Not anywhere.
So Chris's elegant, if ultimately deadly, solution
was to simply get rid of the map. He ensured that, in his own mind, if nowhere else, the land remained terra incognita. He chose the conceptual freedom of mapelessness over the practical reality of survival.
So he's forced back to bus 142. He falls back into his routine of hunting small game and foraging. But the journal entries start becoming this desperate tally.
35 squirrels, 5 jays, 2 frogs.
And despite the quantity, Alaskan small game is incredibly lean, especially in late summer. He was running up a massive caloric deficit. His body was literally consuming its own muscle to survive.
We know he grew so thin that his cants wouldn't stay up. He had to make a new belt out of a strip of blanket. He was balanced precariously right on the edge of starvation.
And this leads directly to the final fatal mistake, the one involving foraging. When a body is that compromised, any small misstep can lead to catastrophic results.
That journal entry for July 30th is short, but it's absolutely terrifying. It reads, "Extremely weak, fault of pot seed, much trouble just to stand up, starving, great jeopardy."
Pot seed. He's referring to the wild potato plant, right? Hedysarum alpinum.
Yes. And this is an important plant because its roots are actually edible. They were a staple for the Dena'ina Indians. McCandless had been safely eating those roots since late June.
But as summer wore on, the roots became tough and woody.
So he pivoted. He started eating the pea-like seed pods instead. And that was the pivot point that led to the chemical crisis.
Why did the seeds suddenly become lethal when the roots were safe?
Well, initially there was a lot of confusion about this. Some early reporting suggested he'd simply confused the edible wild potato with a similar-looking but entirely poisonous plant, the wild sweet pea.
But that wasn't it.
No. Later scientific analysis by chemical ecologists suggests the problem was actually an alkaloid called swainsonine.
Okay, can you explain what swainsonine is and how it functions as a poison?
Sure, swainsonine is an alkaloid that's produced by a very common mold, Rhizoctonia leguminicola. And this mold grows on various legumes, including the wild potato, especially in soggy climates like Alaska in the summer. The alkaloid then concentrates in the plant's seed pods in late summer.
And what does it do to the body?
The key is that swainsonine is a potent inhibitor of certain digestive enzymes, specifically the ones involved in metabolism.
But the truly devastating factor here is the synergy between the poisoning and his already critical state of starvation.
Exactly. When a person is already in a state of advanced starvation, meaning they lack the necessary glucose and protein reserves, their liver can't produce the metabolic pathways it needs to effectively excrete or detoxify the alkaloid.
So the toxin just builds up in his system.
It accumulates and it essentially paralyzes his body's ability to mobilize energy. So even if the plant wasn't instantly lethal, the alkaloid caused severe muscle weakness and an inability to move, to hunt, or to hike effectively.
That's the final brutal trap. The swainsonine rendered him immobile. Even if the river had dropped a week later, he would have been physically too weak to even stand up, let alone hike out or successfully hunt for game.
He was trapped and thus doomed to starve because he could no longer sustain the minimum physical effort required for survival.
And we see this final, inevitable decline chronicled in his journal. He becomes too weak to hunt. And his last attempt to reach out, to finally abandon that solitary philosophy, comes on August 12th.
He posts that desperate SOS note on the bus door, and significantly, he abandons his famous moniker. He signs it with his birth name.
Chris McCandless, August. I need your help. I am injured near death and too weak to hike out of here. That is the moment Alexander Supertramp gives way to Chris McCandless, a young man who is terrified and desperate for human connection.
We know he had finished reading Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago, and he highlighted a specific passage
About the need to surrender to something absolute, life or truth or beauty, which suggests a final, necessary acceptance, a surrender to the absolute reality of his situation.
His last journal entry was August 19th, which suggests he likely died around August 18. And his final actions are maybe the most profound and contradictory moment of his entire 2-year quest.
Before crawling into that sleeping bag his mother made him, he takes one last photo of himself.
The image is haunting. It shows him emaciated, skeletal, but he's smiling, almost serenely, at peace, like a monk gone to God. And he's holding up a note to the camera.
The note reads, "I have had a happy life, and thank the Lord. Goodbye, and may God bless all."
The final acceptance of his fate is just. It's juxtaposed against the absolute tragedy and the sheer grief he was about to inflict on his family and his friends.
McCandless's journey was, well, it was undeniably unique in its circumstances and his specific brand of idealism. But the source material is very clear. He was not an anomaly.
Not at all. Alaska has always been a magnet for dreamers and misfits, people seeking existential answers through isolation and hardship. His story fits into a long tradition of men pushing the limits of self-reliance, often with tragic results.
And contextualizing his quest by looking at some of his counterparts, it reveals that his specific fatal errors, that blend of intelligence and arrogance, are distinct from, say, mental illness or just simple administrative oversight.
Right. Let's start with Gene Rosellini, the idealist who actually gave up. He was from a wealthy Seattle family, a lot like McCandless, but he ran this massive 10-year anthropological experiment in Cordova, Alaska.
His goal was simple, right? To see if a modern human could regress, live completely independently of modern technology using only Neolithic tools.
Exactly. He exercised compulsively, he hunted with primitive weapons, and he lived in this basic windowless hovel.
And what was Rosellini's final conclusion after a decade of intense effort?
He abandoned the experiment. He concluded in a letter that he had learned the hard way that it is not possible for human beings as we know them to live off the land. He proved that the romantic ideal of the self-sufficient savage was, for him, scientifically unfeasible.
But unlike McCandless, Rosellini lived long enough to conclude his hypothesis was false.
He did, though tragically he was later found dead from a self-inflicted knife wound in 1991, which suggests this deep existential disillusionment that went way beyond just the failure of his experiment.
Okay, so contrast that with John Waterman, the mentally ill climber. He represents a different kind of drive toward isolation.
Waterman was a brilliant but deeply unstable mountaineer. He achieved fame as the third youngest person to climb Mount McKinley, but his behavior was profoundly erratic.
Extremely compulsive, right. He logged every single conversation he had.
He did, and he had these bizarre public moments, like running for U.S. president on the Feed the Starting Party platform. His end was really marked by a total psychological dissolution.
His final winter attempt on Denali was minimalist and completely ill-equipped. He took only flour, sugar, and Crisco.
And he deliberately discarded his radio. He was assumed to have fallen into a crevasse. Waterman's journey was clearly driven by profound mental instability and perhaps a suicidal inclination. That's a critical difference from McCandless, who, though idealistic and rigid, did not share that obvious mental illness or a death wish.
Then you have Carl McCunn, the absent-minded fatalist. His story perfectly illustrates the danger of simple administrative incompetence in the wilderness.
McCunn was an amateur photographer who flew into the Brooks Range in 1981 with 1,400 pounds of provisions. He was well supplied, but he committed the staggering oversight of forgetting to arrange for his flight out in August.
He just forgot to book a ride home?
He just forgot. He spent the entire autumn waiting. He even failed to flag down a passing plane because he thought they were just checking on him.
And he subsequently starved to death over the winter.
He did. He committed suicide in late November 1981, leaving a journal expressing deep regret over throwing away most of his shotgun shells early on.
So McCandless was unlike Waterman in that he wasn't mentally ill. And he was unlike McCunn because he didn't assume anyone would just automatically save him. He was relying entirely on himself.
Yes, but he shared that deep impracticality and a shocking lack of respect for the sheer scale of the environment. And you can trace this romantic idealism back decades to Everett Roos, who vanished in the canyons of Utah in 1934 at the age of 20.
Roos was the spiritual predecessor to Supertramp.
He really was. Roos was just as romantic, just as artistic, and equally heedless of personal safety. And like McCandless, he adopted a new name.
Nemo, which is Latin for nobody.
Right. And he wrote these letters expressing strikingly similar yearnings. He wrote, "I shall always be a lone wanderer of the wilderness. I'll find the wildest, loneliest, most desolate spot there is. The impulse to disappear and test one's mettle against the ultimate void is not new. It's a recurring motif in the American myth."
And even Krakauer, the author who brought McCandless's story to life, felt compelled to include a deeply personal parallel from his own life.
His own near-fatal solo climb of the Devil's Thumb in Alaska when he was 23.
Right. He admits he was driven by a similar heedlessness, a similar agitation of the soul, and this complex, strained relationship with his own fiercely competitive father. He was testing himself in ways that mattered, trying to prove his independence and his worth in that harsh, unforgiving environment.
And crucially, Krakauer admits that his own survival was largely a matter of chance. And that is the shared, terrifying commonality here. The belief that intense idealism and sheer will can conquer nature, and the resulting truth that the margin for error is razor thin. For Krakauer, the dice rolled favorably.
For McCandless, a swollen river and a poisonous seed ensured they did not.
So, if we connect this entire saga back to the bigger picture, the tragedy of Chris McCandless is not that he was a victim of a relentless, unforgiving landscape, or that he lacked courage.
No, he was sufficiently skilled, with just his wits and 10 pounds of rice, to survive for 16 weeks. That's a significant feat in itself.
The tragedy lies squarely in the specific, avoidable errors that were born from his absolute idealism. The lack of a map meant that USGS Basket, his salvation at the Teclanica River, remained utterly unknown to him.
And the likely chemical poisoning from the Hedysarum alpinum seeds, ingested when his body was already in such a desperate state that sealed his fate by immobilizing him. He chose a perilously slim margin for error.
And those slim margins were exhausted by those two critical human missteps.
The legacy he left is, well, it's complex. The book royalties from Into the Wild helped establish a scholarship fund in Chris McCandless's name, set up by his parents, Walt and Billy.
And 10 months after his death, his parents finally visited the bus via helicopter. Walt admitted he was less baffled after seeing the severity of the terrain firsthand, and Billy said she found it comforting to know Chris was here, finally ending that terrible period of not knowing anything at all.
It's just... McCandless sought absolute independence, freedom from society, and radical self-reliance. Yet his entire 2-year journey was defined entirely by the intense human connections he made.
Jim Gallion, Wayne Westerberg, Jan Burrs, and the devastated Ron Franz.
And the devastating grief he left behind. The deeper you dive into his quest for solitude, the more evident the impact of his presence becomes.
Ken Slight, the desert rat who investigated Everett Roos's disappearance, maybe summarized this tension best when he was describing seekers like Rutens and McCandless.
What did he say?
He noted, "We like companionship, see, but we can't stand to be around people for very long, so we go get ourselves lost, come back for a while, then get the hell out again." McCandless never got the chance to come back.
McCandless's final written line, "I have had a happy life," stands in such sharp, painful contrast to the sorrow and bafflement that enveloped his family and friends. The provocative thought we want to leave you with, the question for you to mull over as you process the complexity of Alexander Supertramp, is this. If the ultimate goal is liberation through absolute solitude, can the ultimate act of self-reliance ever truly be solitary?
Or is its meaning always, in the end, defined by the relationships and the deep, aching absence left behind?